Thanks, Bill. First, I'd like to start by thanking the conference organizers for convening this gathering, for us to be able to organize, build camaraderie, and really in this session, learn from our struggles. I'd like to again thank you, Bill, for extending the invitation and even curating this panel, which I think really has a lot of juice, a lot of energy, and hopefully will generate a lot of discussion and sort of entry points for future organizing at the grassroots. I've really been tasked with kicking off our discussion. As Bill mentioned, my name is Janelle Hope. I'm a scholar activist. I grew up in Oakland, California, organized for some years in Sacramento in response to sort of police violence and in support of Black art and cultural spaces. However, for the past 3 years, I've been in Texas, where I'm a college professor. My research is around Afro-Asian solidarity and the history of Black anti-fascism. Presently, I organize with a Black and Brown racial justice organization in Fort Worth called United Fort Worth. And a lot of the work that I do in community and in concert with UFW, again, is sort of around political education. I'll talk a lot about sort of how we're interweaving sort of anti-fascism into our current or our upcoming Freedom School curriculum, which will be rolling out the next couple of weeks, and also how anti-fascism is woven in sort of our work around mutual aid throughout the city. As we all know, but just to sort of set the tone, as we all know, we are currently witnessing the global rise of fascism as leaders like Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, the outgoing Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, China's President Xi Jinping, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as well as a host of others, have all embraced nationalism and authoritarianism, using their country's police and or military to incarcerate and even kill racial and ethnic minorities. But we don't need to look beyond our own colonial borders to see fascism flourishing and decimating communities. It's happening across our own country, and has been happening for quite some time. And while the relentless boot of fascism continues to stamp out any real sense of democracy, freedom, and justice, we must recognize that anti-fascism is the rallying and organizing point of entry, as majority of our struggles, whether they be across race, gender, class, sexual orientation, immigration, education, and even thinking about this very horrific epidemic of gun violence that we are living through, are all inextricably linked to American fascism and the continuum of the American fascist regime. As an educator, I think it's always important to sort of have some sort of shared language and understanding as we come into these sort of spaces and discussions, especially as it relates to fascism. Part of my work, both in community and in the classroom, is breaking down fascism. What is it? How does it take root? Many of us hear fascism and it evokes a feeling of unease. I remember I had a comrade who would just like wantonly say, at least at the moment, I thought it was like, you're just overusing fascism. Like, this is just fascist, right? Years later, I understand, like, yes, we live in a fucked up fascist world, right? But it evokes this unease, right? Images, Holocaust, gas chambers, things sort of start to come into motion, which I think is important, but at the same time, it also reduces fascism to this sort of one part of the world, one moment within history, and doesn't recognize fascism as something that has evolved, right? That has taken root, and really sort of has a lot of its origins here within the US. I argue that fascism has its roots in European colonization, American settler colonialism, and Native American land dispossession. I look at how American fascism has influenced slavery, and even lynchings following Reconstruction. Today, we see fascism at work, certainly within our police departments across the country, at the ballot box, and our local school board meetings, which are just a fucking muck, and in the increasingly authoritarian language of many of our federal, state, and local leaders. So what is fascism? Again, I'm trying to give us some sort of shared language as an entry point for this discussion. And I actually want to share like this really cool slide. I promise you, it's not wordy at all. I think it's useful. Let's see what you all think. Share, let's see if my tech works. All right, so I talk about fascism in community and to my students through these like 8 elements, which I hope will help us come together and have some synergy and confluence when we delve into what anti-fascism is. I start with saying that fascism is law and order on steroids. Authoritarianism is the sort of first key element. It's marked by this extreme militarism and police violence. Obviously, we think about Nazis and black shirts and Gestapo and SS, all those sorts of things. It's about literal discipline and punishment. It's about living under a police state. The sort of second element of fascism that I often get folks to think about is we oftentimes associate fascism with some sort of charismatic dictator, right? That postures this sort of what I'll get to as a third, this anti-democratic or far-right nationalism. What I push back a little bit in my work is that fascism doesn't always have to have a singular dictator, right? I think fascism as a sort of cultural and social influence does absolutely rely on having some sort of talking head, right? That helps it sort of grow and amplifies the message. However, in American fascism, it's postured through our politicians, right? It's postured through even ordinary citizens that buy into some of the elements of authoritarianism. It shows up in our curriculum. It shows up in many aspects of society. So we don't necessarily solely need that charismatic dictator to denote that fascism is afoot and running amok. The third element of fascism, which gets to sort of the politics of it all, is that it is anti-democratic, it's nationalist, it's far right, meaning that there's for a suppression of free speech, elections, voting. There is this push for a singular media sort of state narrative, national unity, expansion, this sort of belief in an expansion of empire, imperialism, or even for us, sort of American exceptionalism, right? A key part for understanding sort of how race and fascism are very much interconnected is that fascism is built upon the law, right? Fascism relies on the strength of the law to carry out the anti-democratic practices. And within that law, we oftentimes see this dual application of the law that I talk about in my work, where there are certain privileges that are granted to one group, typically those who are, I'll get to the racial purity stuff, but whiteness, right? While those same protections and privileges are not granted to others, right? And in fact, the law is written and wielded in a very punitive way towards those who don't fit this sort of understanding of what race making under a sort of this fascist regime will look like, right? We typically talk about Aryan, Nordic, those sorts of things, and thinking about race and sort of fascist law in Europe. Fascism is fueled by racial capitalism, right? And that the landowners and the elites and all those folks that own the means of production oftentimes support the dictators. We can talk about our own oligarchs here and how they support and uplift the American fascist regime that exists here. Racial purity and sort of white supremacy is at its core, right? Fascism is about maintaining a singular sort of racial superiority belief. It's articulated usually in some sort of manifesto that is then codified in law. Obviously, over the last 2-3 weeks, we've been seeing lots on great replacement theory that again is sort of echoing that, again, this is a major element of fascism that we are continuing to see revealed over and over and over within our country. Genocide, ethnic cleansing is one that we see, right, in different forms. Sometimes it's very much overt. Other times it's more covert and sinister and thinking about histories of lynchings and mass incarceration in this country. But we recognize that these are all sort of strategies that have an endpoint of dramatically reducing the living masses of folks who are on the racial and ethnic margins. And finally, fascism at its root is a sexist and hypermasculine project. You cannot talk about racial purity and white supremacy without instituting policies that are aimed at controlling birthing people's bodies, historically and particularly women's bodies, right? You cannot talk about racial purity without talking about the current abortion movement, discussions on Roe. So I like to use this slide just to be able to give us some sort of shared language of how you identify fascism. What does it look like, right? Sometimes you'll have all these pieces, sometimes you'll have a few, but I'm gonna stop sharing from here and continue with my talk.
5 minutes to know.
Thank you. So this is how fascism works. These are the ingredients. When I first began researching on my early research project on Afro-Asian solidarity, I turned to the coalitional work of the Black Panther Party and how they engaged Asian American groups like the Red Guards and Asian American Political Alliance. In 1969, they host this really formative conference called the United Front Against Fascism conference in Oakland. They identify fascism as the main binding thread that was needed to organize in response to all of the sort of issues that they were experiencing on the ground. They would later create these national committees to combat fascism, the sort of, I guess, multiracial Black Panther Party chapters that focused more on mutual aid, survival, and community response work, right? Because that was the anti-fascist work that they saw was necessary, right? So not just feeding folks, but also supporting tenants and those that needed healthcare and were being preyed upon by slumlords and medical facilities. They saw how racial capitalism, again, through healthcare and through like housing rights was fueling fascism. These are the types of connections and discussions that I try to impart within my own community when it comes to understanding the totality of fascism and why anti-fascism must be a multiracial solidarity project. Anti-fascism is labor organizing, it is mutual aid work, it is abolitionist, it can be anarchist, it is art and cultural. There are art and cultural sort of anti-fascist strategies I talk about. It's within EJ work, right? It takes many forms, right? So that's how, as a sort of political educator and a classroom educator, I talk about fascism, right? I'm currently preparing for our community freedom school, which will be taking place in the next 2 weeks. Very much modeled in the spirit of the student nonviolent coordinating committees. And we're launching what we're calling sort of a series of experiential community-based modules that provide our community, primarily the North Side and Polytechnic communities in Fort Worth, with political education, foregrounding how to understand what fascism is, but also how to be anti-fascist in a very like intercommunal sense. So part of it is we cover and talk about movement history in our modules, right? We foreground our own community struggles. And this year is going to be really interesting because our Freedom School is happening. It's starting the week that the Atatiana Jefferson trial is starting. Atatiana Jefferson was a Black woman who was killed in her home in Fort Worth by a police officer that was conducting a wellness check in 2019. So the trial has been delayed. And so we're trying to leave room for within the programming to see how that trial will also take shape. So it's going to be a very challenging and interesting summer. Thank you. We do a lot around mutual aid work. We have a really dynamic food program in the city called Funky Town Fridge, and we feed hundreds of Fort Worth natives via community refrigerators that are all around the city. We're doing some modules on skill-based campaign building and power mapping and understanding how political leadership, again, is sort of bolstering fascism within the city and within the state. Our LGBTQIA youth that are very much involved in the organization are very much interested in providing sort of joyful reprieve spaces, in particular for our trans youth of color that have been disproportionately targeted by the Texas state legislature. And another sort of module that if I had time, I would talk through a little bit more is some of the EJ work that we've been doing and doing these sort of field trips to, well, not even field trips because in our backyard, millions of Texans live within a mile of natural gas or oil site. And so teaching folks how to do citizen science work in terms of soil data and air pollution collection to be able to advocate for safer and better communities and how to clean those contaminated sites as all, these are anti-fascist projects. We frame them as that, reframe the work as that. And I think it's important because it instills an understanding of how fascism really is the root of many of the evils that we see unfolding within our city and our state and our nation. I'm going to stop there because I'm sure I'm going to go over time. But if you have questions, I look forward to them during our Q&A. Fighting ICE is fighting fascism. Yes.
All right. Thanks so much, Janelle. We'll hand it over to Charisse.
Good afternoon, everybody. So Bill graciously introduced me as an organizer. I am an academic who has recently joined an organization. I still hesitate to call myself an organizer because I'm still learning, but I am a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. I am the co-coordinator of the research and political education team, and I am growing toward being an organizer. But in true academic fashion, I'm going to read a paper that's about the sort of longue durée of fascism with, yes, thank you, Proletariat versus Bourgeoisie, with sort of thinking about Black people at the center of how we understand a sort of US enunciation of fascism, particularly after World War II, not least because I do believe that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, as the saying goes. And so much of the things that we're recognizing about the uptick in fascism or sort of fascistic political economy and social relations today are not new. They've just reappeared in their particular articulation. So on January 6, 2021, a mob of white supremacists, white nationalists, and neo-Nazi elements, including the Oath Keepers, 3%ers, Proud Boys, and Boogaloo Boys, stormed the Capitol in an attempt to undermine the 2020 election results and the transfer of power from Trump to Biden. The attack was in part a response to the return of power to the Democratic Party, which has a more diverse and progressive base, more diverse, more progressive, and not necessarily objectively progressive, base that reflects the changing demographics of US society. In true cross-class collaboration, the event was financially supported by members of the 1%, including the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, hedge fund heiress Rebecca Mercer, and Julie Jenkins Fancelli of the Publix supermarket chain. These events have been variously described as a coup, an insurrection, a riot, a violent protest, and treason. And as hearings about the insurrection continue, more details emerge that hint at collusion or spell out collusion outright at many levels. Their election of duty and the participation of scores of police officers, former military personnel, and elected officials from around the country, in addition to working class and petty bourgeois elements. And so that cross-class collaboration is essential and actually foundational to fascism. So many have called January 6th a harbinger for, or indeed a manifestation of fascism in the United States. Many contend that Trumpism inaugurated fascism in our times, and such claims are not without merit. So like Janelle, in terms of presenting sort of what we mean by fascism, I will draw on the 2003 article titled Fascism Anyone by Lawrence W. Britt, who identified 14 characteristics of fascism based on his study of regimes in Germany, Indonesia, Italy, Spain, and several Latin American countries. The first is powerful and continuing nationalism. And we see this, for example, in the imposition of US foreign policy imperatives, even on its own allies, and an ongoing challenge to any attempt at multipolarity through, for example, the Cold War with China. We see disdain for human rights, or the second element is disdain for human rights. And we see this, for example, with the recent Supreme Court case, which reduced the rights of the imprisoned to challenge their imprisonment, even if they're innocent, right? That is a fundamental attack on human rights. The third element is the construction of enemies or scapegoats as a source of unification. And of course, we see the continued demonization of Antifa, the radical left, socialism, and even the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The fourth element is military supremacy, again, manifested in the United States' ongoing hawkish foreign policy. The fifth element is rampant sexism. And we, of course, are seeing this particularly with the attack on Roe and all of these state level policies that are meant to undermine women's reproductive health, of course, which have a disproportionate effect on racialized and working class and poor women. The next element is controlled mass media. We know that the mainstream media is literally the sort of media arm of the state. They just simply parrot whatever the police or the state tell them to say. Obsession with national security is the next element. And we see this with the quote, defense budget, right? That increases every single year, and it's all but defensive. It is offensive, and it's actually a sort of pipeline to enrich Raytheon and Boeing and other private financial corporations. The next is the lack of separation between government and religion. The next is aggressive protection of corporate power. We saw this with trillions being made by corporations, why millions and millions have suffered economically. The next element is the suppression of labor. And then finally, there's a disdain for intellectuals and artists. And this is manifested, for example, contemporarily with the attack on like critical race theory, which is everything and nothing, right? It's anything that challenges like the 1776 mythology. So the material conditions we're facing, which have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, extraordinary inflation and war, are not unlike the conditions that led to the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. Interestingly, scholars, organizers, activists, and journalists operating in what I call the tradition of radical Blackness offered a similar analysis of US society following World War II by analyzing the dire situation of Black Americans. I define radical Blackness as communist, socialist, anti-capitalist, and/or revolutionary analyses of the structural and material conditions of local, national, and global Blackness, and efforts to imagine and bring into being liberating possibilities for all oppressed people. It centers critical political economy analysis, attends to interracial class conflict and antagonism, theorizes the international character of Blackness as a special condition of surplus value extraction, and strives for the eradication of capitalist exploitation. Racialization is understood to emanate from the capitalist mode of production in which both Blackness and radicalism become threats to property relations, labor hierarchies, and forms of accumulation and expropriation that constitute the capitalist world economy. Informed by and engaged with real world struggles, radical Blackness encompasses African descendants' multivalent and persistent anti-systemic and counter-hegemonic challenges to political economies legitimating discourses that sustain racialized and gendered exploitation, exclusion, dispossession, and class-based domination. It is often routed through or enunciated from within the United States, given the latter's importance to the development of the capitalist world economy since the 17th century, its rise to global hegemony after World War II, and histories of anti-Black racial oppression and terror rooted in capitalist imperialism. As such, radical Blackness has variously been targeted by US authorities as extremism, authoritarianism, and terrorism to rationalize the use of extraordinary force, violence, and exclusion. So in the petition, we charge genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. It is a long name. William L. Patterson and the Civil Rights Congress conveyed that the threat of fascism in the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War was all too real. And one of its striking features was the spike in violence against Black people. The charge of genocide was meant to save bourgeois democracy from the capitalist machinations, which might well lead to fascism. And they said that this should be a matter of concern to all who were conscious of the evils of racism, and that these were among the foremost fruits of capitalism. As World War II gave way to the Cold War, the United States consolidated its global hegemony with policies and practices that were eerily reminiscent of what they call Hitlerism. In the US case, however, as had been the reality historically, the target was those of African descent. Likewise, when collaboration with the Soviet Union against the Axis powers quickly descended into confrontation, communism and adjacent forms of radicalism became primary targets of US foreign and domestic policy. Such anti-radicalism was meant to terrorize African Americans, attenuate the gains made by labor, and control forms of militancy that after 1945 were construed by all three branches of the US government as foreign inspired and threatening to the stability and security of the United States. As We Charge Genocide will argue, the rise of US fascism could be gleaned in the interconnection of genocide against Black people in the United States and US imperialism abroad. As such, the curtailment of the former was the key to ending the latter. Additionally, these thinkers in the early Cold War sensed the threat of fascism in the increasingly draconian anti-communist policies adopted by the US government. Domestic subversion was targeted by an anti-radical state apparatus that comprised a network of government organizations, including the State Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Justice Department, congressional committees, including the House Committee on American Activities, instrumentalities like the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, and key Supreme Court decisions like Dennis v. United States, which was decided in 1951. So all of that to say, all three branches of government are foundational to US fascism. 5 minutes, Bill? Got it. I saw you. Okay, perfect. And so it's not only all three branches of government, but it's also, there's all of these different apparatuses that work together to sort of codify fascism in the law and in policy and practice. And so there are a number of pieces of legislation that are integral to this, including the 1938 Foreign Agents Registration Act, the 1939 Hatch Act, the 1940 Voorhees Act, the Alien Registration Act of 1940, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, and a whole bunch of executive orders. I'm not going to go through all of these in the interest of time, but these entities, among others, work together to construct discourses of un-Americanist subversion and threat to national security. At the top of the list were those who needed to be rooted out, or excuse me, at the top of the list of those who needed to be rooted out were the communists and their sympathizers, which was a broad designation that included anyone who disagreed with or criticized the US government's Cold War politics, including peace activists, civil rights leaders, dissident artists, and progressive labor organizers of all types. US communists and fellow travelers, especially those of African descent and foreign origin, were particularly sensitive to attacks on their freedom of speech, press, and association by the anti-radical state apparatus, which they interpreted as the first step towards fascism on their own shores. Black Chicago Communist Party leader Claude Lightfoot, for example, noted the negative trifecta that arose after World War II, which was the Cold War, the escalation of a fascist danger at home, and the violent return of the lynch mob. He said, quote, "The nation had not experienced a period like this since the days of the Alien and Sedition laws," end quote. Of particular concern regarding the rise of fascism was a provision of the McCarran Act that gave the president the right during a national emergency to take control of all institutions of government and put people in jail without trial. And by the way, that aspect of the McCarran Act has never been overturned. So in the declaration of a national emergency, we can all be like put in concentration camps if you have a security index card. Anyway, the Black radical poet Langston Hughes had similar misgivings about the Smith Act. Regarding the June 20th, 1948 indictment of 11 CPUSA leaders, he noted, quote, "First, Hitler locked up the communists, the Jews were number 2. In America, the Negroes are number 2 on history's list. If the 12 communists are sent to jail, in a little while, they will send Negroes to jail simply for being Negroes and to concentration camps just for being colored," end quote. From a prison cell in Terre Haute, Indiana, the former New York City councilman and Black communist paragon Benjamin J. Davis Jr. correspondingly argued that impending fascism in the United States was most manifest in the oppression of Black people. He said, toward the end of World War II, the pro-fascist Negro-hating forces, which have been held in check during the war, began to break loose. The first section of the population to feel the rigors of reaction was, of course, the Negro people. They were forcibly reminded that the Negro was still the victim of a system of national oppression and segregation. American imperialism had not changed its spots. I have this whole part about Claudia Jones, but essentially she makes a similar argument about how the reactionary elements of monopoly capitalism came together with big business and the elements of anti-Black racial oppression to buttress imperialism and to sort of portend this rise of fascism.
2 minutes, Cherise.
Okay. So a particularly pernicious event that happened in the post-World War II moment that immediately came to mind as the events of January 6, 2020 were unfolding, 2021 were unfolding, is the Peekskill riots. This terrible event took place on August 27, 1949, at this concert that the Harlem chapter of the Civil Rights Congress organized, at which essentially Paul Robeson was scheduled to sing. They were attacked by this vicious mob of police officers, white supremacists, and some government officials. Not to be deterred, they met again the next week on September 4th, 1949. They were again attacked. Over 200 people were injured, and over 900 police officers on the scene sided with, aided, and encouraged that attack. The governor of New York, Thomas Dewey, went on to blame the riot not on the white supremacists, but on a communist plot. And interestingly, I don't know if you all remember, right after January 6th happened, some of the Congress people were trying to say that it was Antifa that had infiltrated this mob, right? So again, the communists, the radicals, the left-wing people often become the scapegoat. So there's so much more to say about this post-World War II moment and how the context of demobilization and the increase in violence against Black people for these Black radicals portended this rise of fascism. But what I'll say is that on this analysis, we can see why the January 6, 2021 attack, in tandem with ongoing anti-Black police lynchings, the imposition of draconian sanctions on countries throughout the world, from Venezuela to Zimbabwe to Iran, and the recent attempt to leave Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela out of the Summit of the Americas, U.S. supported fascist and right-wing regimes, including its dog whistling around the recent Colombia elections, billions upon billions spent for war, while the milquetoast Build Back Basic bill, also known as Build Back Better, with its pretense of social welfare, is moribund. The attack on women's reproductive rights and the criminalization and demonization of Antifa and Black Lives Matter, in contradistinction to the lax approach to white marauders who stormed the Capitol, portend the rise of fascism. Last point. Like those in the tradition of radical Blackness who analyzed and organized against the rise of fascism after the Second World War, we would do well to have a broader understanding of what attacks on democracy actually look like, how they're rooted in anti-Black racial oppression, anti-radicalism, and the defense of capital against society, and how these things are not reducible to Donald Trump's influence. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sharice. Ben, take it away.
Hey, y'all. Really happy to be here. Presentations have been great so far. The conference in general has been great so far. Really great attendance. Thanks so much to all that have been helping organize and contributing to the discussion. I'm not an academic like my comrades before me. So I'm going to focus more on kind of like our organizing experiences here in Denver, because we've had quite a few interactions and experience with thanks, Sophie. With the FASH out here in Denver. So I'm going to talk about those a little bit. I'm going to share my screen right quick to get that out of the way. How's that look for everybody? Good?
Good, yeah. Yeah.
All right, great. So over the past several years, centering around the George Floyd uprising, the Denver communists, our local anti-fascist comrades, have had several direct encounters with the right-wing, pro-cop, conservative, anti-choice, anti-vax, the wannabe fascists, and the explicitly fascist contingent in Denver. These encounters have included lots and lots of internet trolling, physical altercations, facing off and heckling, court harassment, chat infiltration, and even death. Despite the far right's best efforts, the loose anti-fascist coalition of Denver has succeeded in reducing the influence and presence of the far right in almost every form. Cool, so I'm gonna tell a couple stories. We got some slides just from our experiences, some shots over the last several years of organizing against the fascists and the far right. So right here, we got, does that look good? Is that good for everybody? Yeah. Right here, we have some proper, some proper Nazis, some good old fashioned Hail Hitler Nazis. These are some cats that have been around Denver for a lot, and we've encountered them several times. The picture to the left was taken at a comic book store that was hosting a queer drag afternoon on Sundays, and these fash would come out and heckle the queer kids that were coming out to do that. So we showed up that several times to help protect and escort kids into the comic book. Why isn't it going? There we go. Well, we got good old fashioned America dads. your classic suburban conservative, America-loving, gun-toting dads. These shots were all from a car caravan that we took through a neighborhood in Aurora to go to an ICE warden's house. Yeah. We got the classic like anti-vax, Anon and homophobes. Some Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys are mixed in there. Lots of anti-vaxxers. That whole kind of like group of people. The alt-right incel provocateurs. This is a guy who was around a lot a couple years ago who used to dox and take pictures of leftists and activists. The doxing honestly resulted in virtually no consequence to any leftists after like the kind of initial panic that your picture and personal information could be shared on far right networks and stuff like that. Several of our members were doxed and no real consequences ever came of that besides just like the kind of the freakiness. There's the frat gang fash, the Proud Boys. These guys would show up a lot with this kind of like yellow looking gear. And the picture on the left is when they showed up to a court date for one of our comrades who had gotten a charge. And of course, court dates are all public public information. Everybody can see it. And so they would use that opportunity to show up and harass us. And so we, of course, would organize court support systems to have our members and other comrades show up and help protect and keep people safe. There's the Patriot Militia Fash. This tattoo on his left hand is a 3%er tattoo. This specific picture was actually taken of a cop who had a couple years earlier had murdered Paul Castaway, who is a Lakota man here in Denver, and whose family we've done a lot of organizing with over the years, trying to bring justice to his family, but also just raising awareness about indigenous murders by the police. This is more kind of patriot militia fash. These guys really cracked me up. Quotes like UADF recon team standing by in Denver, #ghost, #16 seconds. I think these guys are pretty funny. They're always posting some kind of like really over the top patriotic, thinly veiled messaging. And they show up to actions kind of dressed like this with their like paramilitary, like Walmart hunting gear looking stuff, trying to act tough and be big. And then this is another one, the Colorado Unorganized Constitutional Militia, pronounced CUCM. Don't know where their marketing team went on that one, but that's what they chose. And this was a document that was some of their rules of engagement that we had gotten through one of our comrades infiltrated one of their like secure chats. And so we got some of their documents talking about their rules of engagement. And this is some of the pages from that manual. This whole manual is kind of is characterized by a group of people that want to simultaneously uphold the law while also understanding or while also thinking that the law doesn't go far enough. So they're kind of caught in this like brown shirt position of wanting to help out law enforcement and support the boys in blue, while also being enraged that oppressed people everywhere are standing up to police oppression and to fascism everywhere. This is more from that. They have like a little gear list. They have listed here zip ties and at least $20 in cash. A couple ripped up t-shirts for gags and blindfolds. So they're trying to like kind of kidnap leftist activists, BLM and anti-fascist activists. We are seeing our republic under attack from Marxists that aim to destroy everything we have ever built in the last 2.5 centuries. We can't let her succumb to Marxism and anarchy. These are the kind of like over the top, like real melodramatic kind of like appeals that characterize a lot of these fascist publications. There's your regular old biker racists, kind of a classic group. You know, a lot of them veterans, a lot of them that kind of thing. This guy on the right here will be featured in a couple of slides later, in a story later. The bikers against radical Islam. I'm not sure when this picture was taken, but they showed up to an action that was the coalition to close the concentration camp. They showed up to an action for like 20 of them a couple years back, and really didn't do much besides kind of stand around the whole time. But yeah, they're kind of around in Denver. And then we've had several kind of like face-offs with these like kind of militia-looking fascist types. You can kind of see the like military regalia that they have, you know, that they have on. This was a relatively early night during the George Floyd uprising, when this group of, I think there was like maybe 20 or 30 of them, kind of came up behind a protest and started like shining flashlights on us and yelling things. And so a couple of the George Floyd protesters kind of turned around and confronted them, and ended up backing them way down several blocks down, until the cops finally came and kind of saved them, and then we took off. And then this is the second face-off. This is later during the George Floyd rebellion. I think this is at the police station. We had gone to the police station to a protest, and another large group here we go. Another kind of large group of these fascist groups or fascists came up behind us. We had another kind of another face-off. This is another one. You can kind of see them there with their like shields and knee pads, and one of them, this guy always brings his German Shepherd with him as like an attack dog or something, but it always like looks like the sweetest dog in the world, and I'm sure wants nothing more than to just like get a treat and some pets. This is some more shots. We are everywhere and unstoppable. My swastika, some of our local cats in the bottom left that I think moved out of the city.
5 minutes.
Another face-off. Thank you. This is another shot of that. We got shot with frozen paintballs at some point. All this. So in 2020, there was a large police appreciation day, which is held every year in the Greek amphitheater. So it's a big police appreciation day, and every year the Denver left comes down and kind of snuffs it out. This was the year of George Floyd, so numbers for this counter protest were really large, and the counter protest ended up getting pretty violent. We kind of forced these like pro coppers out of the city, and then the following year we ended up organizing with a couple of Black women who were like fresh out of high school. And we were marching with them all during George Floyd, and they reached out to us asking for help to organize the counter protest, the anti-police rally. And because we had opposed it so harshly the year before, they had like maybe 30 people that ended up coming out to this one. So the numbers were vastly reduced, almost comically reduced. Then this is the BLM Antifa soup drive. I'm just going to skip over this honestly, but basically this is the event where they were having a patriot muster. We of course threw a counter protest to try to counter that. And then here's a shot of some of us, the conflict kind of escalating. And then this is the guy from earlier, the biker fascist, who ends up getting killed from a Fox News or a News 9 security detail who is there. And then this is a slide that we had made for that. The necessity, and then I'm just going to talk about a couple of tactics that we used to be successful against the fascists. The necessity of a public-facing, one of those tactics is the necessity of a public-facing, mass-oriented organizational response to fascism and state violence. From the ultra and anarchist milieu, hell-bent on secrecy and elite strike force tactics, we've encountered criticism for insufficient OPSEC, for not blurring faces indiscriminately and hosting organizational meetings fully open to the public. Despite harsh criticisms, warnings, trollings, and threats, we have held the position that good propaganda is essential to build a movement to combat the far right and state violence. The problem isn't infiltration, it's getting enough people in the meeting in the first place. We can absolutely never be successful if anti-fascist organizing is limited to the carefully vetted crew in our immediate circle. Another tactic that we've stayed central to is unflinching and brash confrontation. From our right, self-proclaimed socialists and liberals alike have pleaded pacifism as a means of resistance. Aside from insistence that voting is our best weapon, the moderates have lectured our harsh opposition as aiding in the growth of fascism. Let's be clear, allowing fascism to go unopposed will always be more dangerous than opposing it. Some calling the resistance to fascism bullshit, as if sticking our heads in the sand will make the boogeyman go away. We have maintained our fervent opposition to the fascist worms trying to stand up. The fascists we have had so many encounters with are not dedicated revolutionaries as we are. They're not hard-won to a program, but rather are blandly reacting to toxic masculine trends and propaganda at their local gym. We plan to keep it that way. Remaining focused, another tactic, as a third tactic, remaining focused on the use of our clash with the fascists primarily as a means of recruitment, cadre development, and propaganda. We have no misunderstandings about the limitations of our tiny but mighty organization. We hold no disillusions that the time is now to arm ourselves to start a communist street gang, although it does sound pretty cool. Our confrontational approach has been proven successful to our stated goals of attracting new membership, developing contacts and relationships, as well as developing ourselves in the fine art of how the hell do you lead a protest. No one joined the DC has any misconceptions of our fighty tendencies. They joined because we present and can explain a militant revolutionary Marxist program. Despite all these successes, we've had a couple of failures. We failed to cohere a consistent and permanent fixture of an anti-fascist coalition, and we're still working to gain enough influence within our local leftist community to do so. As Justin illuminated, the ongoing crisis of capitalism continues. We must expect fascism to continue to rise. We must learn how to avidly oppose their every move. As we vie for influence within the working class, and then just a quote from Trotsky to close out. The germ of fascism is endemic in capitalism. A crisis can rise it to epidemic proportions unless drastic countermeasures are applied. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you all, Janelle, Charisse, and Ben. Great presentations.